The locksmith finished in under 4 minutes. I know because I was standing on the front porch of the house I grew up in, watching through the living room window as a stranger changed the locks on my own front door. My mother stood behind him with her arms folded, and a look on her face I'd seen my entire life. That satisfied little smile she wore whenever she'd gotten exactly what she wanted. I was 31 years old. I had just buried my father 3 days earlier, and my mother had locked me out of my childhood home before the funeral flowers had even wilted. My name is Claire, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of how the woman who gave me life spent 30 years trying to take it apart, and how, in the end, she handed me everything I needed to finally be free. I didn't scream that afternoon. I didn't bang on the door or beg her to let me in. I just stood there on that cracked concrete porch, holding a box of my father's things she'd left outside like trash, and I made myself a promise. You had no idea what you just started, Mom. You have to understand who my mother is before any of this makes sense. Margaret, she went by Maggie to people she liked, which never included me, was the kind of woman who wore pearls to the grocery store and kept a spotless house and told everyone at church what a devoted mother she was. From the outside, we were a picture-perfect family. Dad worked in insurance. Mom stayed home. My brother Derek and I grew up in a 4-bedroom colonial in a good school district in Ohio, and nobody would have guessed, looking at our Christmas cards, that the inside of that house was a different world entirely. Derek is 4 years older than me and has been my mother's favorite since the day I was born. I'm not saying that with bitterness anymore. I'm saying it as a fact, the way you'd say the sky is blue. There was a hierarchy in our family, and it went Derek, Mom, Dad, the houseplants, and then me. Derek could do no wrong. When he crashed the car at 17, Dad paid the ticket, and Mom made him his favorite dinner that night as a comfort. When I forgot to take out the garbage at 13, I lost my phone for a month. When Derek dropped out of his first semester of college, Mom cried and said the school wasn't a good fit. When I got a partial scholarship to Ohio State, she said, "Don't let it go to your head, Claire. Plenty of people go to college." My father, his name was Robert, and I loved him, truly, was not a cruel man. But he was a weak one. He loved my mother in that quiet, surrendered way some men do, where keeping the peace becomes more important than protecting the people who need protecting. He never intervened. He'd catch my eye across the dinner table sometimes, when Mom would spend 20 minutes complimenting Derek's new job and then pivot to criticizing my haircut, and I could see something like guilt in his face. But he never said a word. I learned early that I was on my own. What that meant practically was this. I put myself through college on loans and that partial scholarship and 2 part-time jobs. I found my own apartment at 22. I built a career in accounting, steady, reliable, invisible work that my mother found deeply unimpressive. I dated, had a long relationship that ended quietly, and built a small, good life in Columbus, while my family lived 40 minutes away in Millbrook. I came home for holidays. I called every Sunday because my father asked me to. I sent birthday cards and helped with yard work in the summers and tried, for 30 years, to be the kind of daughter who deserved a mother who showed up. I should have known better. The first sign that something had shifted came 2 years before my father died. Dad was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. It progressed slowly at first, a tremor in his right hand, some stiffness in the mornings, but within a year he needed help managing his medications and getting to doctor's appointments. My mother called me in a panic the week of his diagnosis, and for one foolish, hopeful moment, I thought maybe this was the thing that would bring us together. A crisis that would remind her I existed. Instead, she called me to inform me of my new responsibilities. "You're good with numbers," she said over the phone, her voice brisk and businesslike. "You'll handle his medical paperwork and insurance. Derek's too busy." Derek, I should mention, was working part-time at a sporting goods store at this point and spent most of his time watching football. But sure, too busy. I didn't argue. I started driving to Millbrook twice a week to help Dad with his appointments. I organized his medications into a system. I got to know his doctors by name. I spent hours on the phone with insurance companies fighting coverage denials. And I'm not telling you this for credit. I did it because I loved my father. But I want you to understand what was happening. I was doing all of it. All of it. And Derek would show up for Sunday dinners, and my mother would beam at him, like he was a saint just for appearing. Derek brought your father his favorite pie, she'd announce, like Derek had performed surgery. Internal thought, he drove 40 minutes and bought a $4 pie from the gas station. I'd just spent 6 hours fighting with the insurance company to cover Dad's physical therapy. But sure, Mom. Derek's the hero. The second incident happened 14 months before Dad passed. I found out by accident because my father mentioned in conversation that my mother had added Derek to the deed of the family home.
Just Derek, not me.
She'd done it quietly with a lawyer and hadn't mentioned it to me at all. It's just practical, my father said, in that apologetic way he had. Derek's closer. He can help if anything happens to the house. Derek lived 20 minutes away. I lived 40. That was the practical distinction my mother had drawn to justify cutting me off from any stake in my childhood home. I sat with my father's hand in mine and I said, very carefully, "Did she talk to you about this before she did it, Dad?" He looked away, which was answer enough. I brought it up with my mother that same evening. I tried to be calm. I tried to use the language I'd read in self-help books about non-confrontational communication. Mom, I just want to understand the decision. The house was always something I thought of as belonging to the family, to both of us. She set down her coffee cup with a small, precise click. Claire, she said, you've always been so independent. You don't need the house. Derek might need it someday. He doesn't have your stability. Internal thought. So, I'm being punished for being responsible. And Derek is being rewarded for being a mess. Of course. I'm not asking for anything unfair, I said. I just wish you'd talk to me about it. I don't need your permission to make decisions about my own home, she said. And that was the end of the conversation. The third incident was 6 months before my father died. My parents' 40th anniversary. I had booked a reservation at the nicest restaurant in Millbrook, the Italian place Dad loved, and ordered a custom photo book I'd spent 3 weeks putting together, filled with pictures from their marriage, their children, their life. Derek forgot entirely. He showed up at the restaurant 40 minutes late with a gift card from Target. My mother spent the dinner talking about how thoughtful Derek was for making the effort to come. I sat across the table and watched my father quietly squeeze my hand under the tablecloth, and I understood something in that moment that I'd been refusing to understand my whole life. She was never going to see me. Not really. Not the way she saw Derek. I was the wrong child. I had always been the wrong child. And no amount of effort or love or quiet sacrifice was going to change that. I stopped trying to change it that night. I kept showing up for my father, but something in me went very, very still. My father died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, in the hospital room where I had spent 3 of the last 7 nights. I was there. Derek was not. My mother was there and she held his hand, and whatever complicated feelings I have about her, I know she loved him in her way. The grief was real. For all of us, I think. But grief, for my mother, lasted approximately 72 hours. 3 days after the funeral, I drove to the house to help sort through some of Dad's belongings. I had a key. The same key I'd had since I was 16, worn smooth from years of use. I used it to let myself in that morning, and my mother met me in the hallway with an expression I didn't immediately understand. I had the locks changed, she said. I blinked. Sorry? The locks. I had them changed yesterday. She nodded toward the porch. I put a box of Robert's things out there for you. The things I thought you'd want. I stared at her. The house was warm behind her. I could smell the same coffee she'd made every morning of my childhood.
Mom.
Dad just died 3 days ago. I know when he died, Claire. You're changing the locks 3 days after. This is my house, she said. Her voice was perfectly level. Mine and Derek's. And I'd appreciate you respecting that. Internal thought. Mine and Derek's. She said it so easily. Like I had never existed. Like 31 years of Sunday phone calls and insurance battles and midnight drives to the hospital had simply never happened. I picked up the box on the porch. I walked to my car. I drove exactly 2 blocks before I had to pull over because I couldn't see through my eyes anymore. And sitting there in my car, crying over a box of my dead father's things, something happened that I didn't expect. The grief burned off like fog. And underneath it was something very clear, and very cold. She made a mistake. She just didn't know it yet. Here's the thing about being the family accountant, the one nobody respects, the one who handles the boring paperwork, is that you end up knowing things. I had managed my father's finances for 2 years. Insurance paperwork, yes. But also his accounts, his investments, his retirement distributions. And 6 months before he died, in one of our quiet evenings when Mom had gone to bed early and Dad and I sat at the kitchen table while I helped him update his files, he told me something. I set up a separate account, he said, almost casually. Years ago, before I got sick. It has your mother's name on it, but the beneficiary designation, I changed it. I looked up from the laptop. Dad. To you, he said. He met my eyes and there was something in his face I had never seen before, deliberate. Decided. It's not a fortune, but it's yours, Claire. After everything. You've earned it. The account held a little over $60,000. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't told anyone. After he died, I quietly filed the beneficiary paperwork with the financial institution and waited. But that wasn't what changed the game. What changed the game was the will. When my mother changed the locks, I had already, very quietly, 2 weeks before my father died, sat with him one last afternoon while he was still lucid enough to talk, and asked him a question I had never dared ask before. Dad, do you have a will?
He did.
He'd had one for years. What I didn't know, what my mother didn't know, was that a year before his diagnosis, my father had updated it. On his own. With a lawyer in a city 20 miles from Millbrook, without telling my mother.
I didn't know the contents.
But I knew it existed. The week after the lockout, I called the attorney whose card I'd found in my father's file box, the one Mom had helpfully left on the porch for me. His name was Gerald Foss, and when I explained who I was and why I was calling, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Miss Claire, your father told me you might call. He said to tell you not to wait. I drove to Gerald Foss's office on a Thursday morning and sat across from a soft-spoken man in his 60s who slid a document across the desk. My father had left me the house. Not the money, the house. The family home in Millbrook, the 4-bedroom colonial, the same house where my mother had added Derek to the deed without my knowledge and then changed the locks 3 days after burying her husband. Except here's what my mother hadn't understood, because she hadn't bothered to look closely at the deed. When she'd added Derek, she hadn't removed my father's ownership stake. She'd added Derek alongside my father, not instead of him. My father still owned 50% of that house, and he had left his 50% to me. I sat very still while Gerald Foss explained the implications. Your mother owns 25%, he said. Your brother owns 25%. You now own 50%. Internal thought. I am the majority owner of the house she locked me out of. Gerald Foss gave me a moment. Then he folded his hands on the desk and said, How would you like to proceed? I thought about my father sitting at that kitchen table with his shaking hand and his quiet eyes. I'd like to proceed carefully, I said. And completely. I did not call my mother. I did not call Derek. I let 3 weeks pass, during which I imagined my mother settling comfortably into her widowhood, assuming everything had gone according to plan. Meanwhile, I met with Gerald Foss twice more. I also called a real estate attorney named Patricia, a sharp-voiced woman who confirmed everything Gerald had said and added several details of her own. As majority owner, I had significant rights. I couldn't simply force my mother from the home. There are protections for surviving spouses, and I had no desire to be cruel. But I had leverage. Real, substantial, legal leverage. The kind that doesn't require screaming or begging or proving anything to anyone. I also quietly received the $60,000 from my father's account. I moved it into a high-yield account and said nothing to anyone. Then I had Gerald send a letter. It was a formal legal notice, on attorney letterhead, delivered by certified mail. It informed my mother and my brother of the contents of the will, the ownership breakdown of the property, and that as majority owner I would be requesting a formal meeting to discuss the future of the home. My mother called me 11 minutes after she signed for the letter. I know this because I was watching my phone. I let it go to voicemail. Her message lasted 4 minutes. I won't repeat all of it, but the key themes were betrayal, ingratitude, How could your father do this? You must have manipulated him. Derek deserves this home. I cannot believe you would do this to your family. I listened to it twice. Then I called Gerald and told him we could schedule the meeting. Derek called next. His message was shorter. Claire, come on. Just call me back. Let's figure this out. Figure this out. As though it were a misunderstanding. As though our mother hadn't stood in a doorway 3 days after our father's funeral and told me this house was hers and Derek's and not mine. I filed the message away and went to make myself dinner. The meeting was held at Gerald Foss's office on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after my father's death. My mother arrived first. She was dressed the way she always dressed for things she considered important: the pearls, the blazer, the careful makeup that took years of effort to make look effortless. Derek arrived 7 minutes late, which was early for him, and sat beside her with the sheepish look of a man who knows he's in trouble but isn't entirely sure why. Their attorney, a local man named Hargrove who handled wills and property disputes, sat on their side of the conference table. I sat on mine. Gerald beside me, Patricia on my left. My mother looked at my attorneys and something shifted in her expression. I think that was the first moment she understood this wasn't a conversation. This was a proceeding. Claire, she began, in her conciliatory voice, the one she used when she wanted something. I think we can resolve this without making it difficult for everyone. I agree, I said. I'd like that. She blinked. She hadn't expected easy agreement. The will is going to be contested, Hargrove said, opening a folder. There are grounds to argue that Robert was not of sound mind when. Mr. Hargrove, Gerald said mildly, Robert Whitfield executed that will 14 months before his diagnosis, in full legal capacity, witnessed by 2 parties, and filed with the county clerk. You're welcome to contest it. We would simply be happy to meet you in court. Silence. My mother turned to me. Her voice dropped.
Claire.
Your father loved this house. He would not have wanted it to become a legal dispute. He would have wanted us to work together.
You're right, I said. He would have.
He also would have wanted me treated like a daughter instead of a servant for 30 years. But we don't always get what we want. Her jaw tightened. Everything I did was for this family. You changed the locks 3 days after he died, Mom. That is my house. It's our house, I said. Legally. 50% mine. I have the documentation on the table in front of you. Derek leaned forward. Look, Claire, we can work something out. Just be reasonable. I turned to look at my brother. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. Derek, I said quietly. I spent 2 years managing Dad's medical care. 2 years of appointments and insurance calls and overnight hospital stays. And in all that time, you came to 3 appointments.
3.
I counted. He opened his mouth. I'm not saying this to hurt you, I continued. I'm saying it so that when you ask me to be reasonable, you understand what reasonable looks like from where I'm sitting. My mother's composure cracked. You always made yourself the martyr, she said, and her voice had an edge in it now, raw and angry. Always keeping score. Always needing to be the victim. I'm not a victim, I said. Not anymore. The room went quiet. Here's what I'm proposing, I said, and I slid a document across the table. One Gerald and Patricia had helped me draft. You and Derek can remain in the home. I have no desire to displace either of you. But as majority owner, I require a formal co-ownership agreement, one that documents all decisions about the property, requires my approval for any changes, and establishes fair compensation for my ownership stake in the event the property is ever sold. Hargrove scanned the document. Additionally, I said, I'd like a formal acknowledgement, in writing, that the original deed change was made without consulting me or my father, and that it does not supersede the terms of his will. My mother stood up. I will not sit here and be humiliated by my own daughter. Then you're welcome to leave, I said. Your attorney has our contact information.
She didn't leave.
She sat back down. And I watched something move across her face, something I had never seen before in 31 years of knowing her. It was the realization that she had no power here. I looked them in the eye. She'd always say to people about difficult situations. She liked to tell stories where she was the steady one, the one who didn't blink. But sitting across from me in that conference room, my mother blinked. "Fine," she said, very quietly. "Fine, Claire."
"Thank you, Mom," I said.
And I meant it in my way. The co-ownership agreement was signed 6 weeks later, after considerable negotiation. It wasn't about the money.
I want to be clear about that.
I didn't need the house. I had my apartment in Columbus, my career, my quiet, good life that I had built entirely on my own. What I needed, what my father had somehow understood I needed, was acknowledgement.
Standing.
The legal fact of my existence in that family story. And I got it. The agreement formalized my 50% stake. It required my signature for any sale. It documented, in dry legal language, the complete history of the property and its ownership. My name was on the deed, next to my mother's, next to Derek's, where it should have been for years. My mother never apologized. I didn't expect one. But Derek, to his credit, called me a month after the agreement was signed. We talked for an hour, longer than we'd talked in years. He admitted that he'd let things slide, that he'd let me carry things he should have helped carry. That wasn't everything, but it was something. My mother's social world, the church friends, the neighborhood women she'd known for decades, found out, as small-town social worlds do, that there had been a legal dispute over the estate. I didn't tell them. I didn't have to. These things have a way of traveling on their own. The story of the daughter who'd been excluded from the deed, who'd been locked out 3 days after the funeral, who'd then turned out to be the majority owner of the house. That story made the rounds. My mother, who had built so much of her identity on the image of a devoted, selfless mother, found that image a little harder to maintain. The $60,000 I received from my father's account I put toward a down payment on a house of my own. A small craftsman bungalow in Columbus, 2 blocks from a park, with a garden in the back where I've since planted tomatoes and sunflowers and a rose bush that blooms every June. I became a homeowner the same year. My mother learned she wasn't the only one.
It's been 2.5 years now.
I drive past the Millbrook house sometimes, when I'm passing through on my way somewhere else. The maples in the front yard are bigger than I remember. The porch railing is still slightly crooked from a winter storm nobody ever fixed. It looks like it always looked ordinary, well-kept, Midwestern. A house on a quiet street. I used to drive past it and feel something heavy settle in my chest. Now I mostly feel nothing, which might sound sad, but is actually one of the most peaceful things I've ever experienced. My mother and I have a relationship now that I would describe as formal. We speak at holidays. She is careful with me in a way she never was before, and I am kind to her in return, but I have no illusions about what that kindness is or isn't. I loved her, and I grieved her long before she died, and whatever version of peace we've arrived at is enough for me. My father gave me more than a legal document. He gave me confirmation that he had seen me, that he had known, all those years when he stayed quiet, exactly what was happening. And that in the end, in the only way he could manage, he tried to make it right. I forgave him. Mostly. Sometimes I think about that afternoon on the porch. The locksmith finishing in 4 minutes. My mother's satisfied smile, through the window. The box of my father's things on the concrete. And I think, she thought she was ending something that day. She thought she was drawing a final line. She was. Just not the one she intended. If you're listening to this and you recognize something in this story, the invisible child, the scorekeeping mother, the brother who never had to earn anything, I want you to hear me say this clearly. The people who underestimate you are not seeing clearly. They are seeing what they need to see in order to maintain the world as they've arranged it. And that is their limitation, not yours. Document everything. Know your rights. Build your life quietly and well. And trust that the truth, eventually, always surfaces. My garden is in bloom right now. The rose bush I planted is doing beautifully. My father would have liked it, I think. He always did have good taste.